The old-school hallway was a symphony of sounds that only he could truly conduct. For the other kids, it was just a noisy corridor to rush through. But for the boy, it was a world painted in echoes and vibrations. The high-pitched squeak of a fresh pair of sneakers on the polished linoleum floor was a bright, sharp yellow. The dull thud of a locker door slamming shut was a deep, flat brown. The low rumble of the heating kicking in was a constant, comforting gray hum beneath everything. He walked with one hand trailing lightly along the cool, textured wall, his fingers reading the bumps and imperfections like Braille, guiding his path. He didn't need a cane here. This was his territory, a map he had memorized with his ears and his hands. Today, a new sound joined the orchestra, a sound that always made his heart beat a little faster. It was faint, coming from the far end of the hall where the auditorium sat. It was the sound of the piano. Not someone playing it, but the sound of its existence. It was a low, almost imperceptible resonance, a secret hum of tightened strings and a wooden frame that seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a story to be told. To him, it wasn't just an instrument. It was a living thing, a giant made of wood and wire, sleeping in the big, empty room. He followed the sound, his steps becoming slower, more deliberate. He loved the auditorium. It was a place of amazing acoustics, where a single whisper could bounce off the high ceiling and sound like a ghost talking to you. But the piano was its soul. He had touched it once, when the auditorium was empty and a cleaning lady had let him explore. His fingers had danced over the cool, smooth ivory keys, some chipped and yellowed with age, others still slick and white. He hadn't dared to press them down, but he had imagined the sounds they would make. Each one a different colored light in his mind's eye. His weekly music class was not in the auditorium, but in a much smaller room down the hall. It was a cramped space that always smelled like old paper, rosin from violins, and the faint, dusty scent of forgotten instruments. The teacher, Mrs. Gable, had a voice that was kind but always carried a note of pity when she spoke to him, like she was talking to a fragile kitten. "Okay. Class, settle down," she'd say, her voice a soft, fluttery blue. "Today, we're going to continue with our keyboards." The boy would find his usual spot on the small plastic chair. He knew where it was because it was the one that didn't wobble. He could hear the other students shuffling, the electric hum of the small keyboards being turned on, the random plinks and plonks as kids hit keys just to hear the noise. It was a chaotic mess of sound, but it was a sound he loved. It was the sound of potential. Mrs. Gable would always bring him a different instrument. "Now, for you, Leo," she would say, her hand gently touching his shoulder. "Why don't you try the tambourine today? You can feel the rhythm so well." And he would. He was good at it. He could keep a perfect beat, his wrist flicking the small instrument with an easy precision. The jingle of the metal disc was a bright, silver sound. But it wasn't the piano. It was a single color when what he wanted was an entire rainbow. He would listen as Mrs. Gable guided a girl named Anna through Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Anna's fingers would stumble, missing notes, the melody coming out in a hesitant, broken rhythm. The boy would sit perfectly still, his body tense, the tambourine silent in his lap. He knew every note of that song. He had heard it 1,000 times. He could hear it perfectly in his head, not just the melody, but the harmony that could go with it, the deep, rich chords that would turn the simple nursery rhyme into something beautiful and grand. He could feel the shape of the song in his hands, the way his fingers wanted to move to create it. This week, as Anna fumbled through the song for the 3rd time, something inside him shifted. The quiet desire that he always kept locked away started to push against its cage. He heard Mrs. Gable say, "No, Anna, your C-sharp is a little flat. Try again." The boy took a quiet breath. He could feel the eyes of no one on him, but he felt like the entire room was waiting. He finally spoke, his voice softer than he intended. "Mrs. Gable?" The music stopped. The plinking from the other keyboards ceased. He could feel the shift in the room's atmosphere as everyone's attention turned towards him. "Yes, Leo?" Mrs. Gable's voice was gentle. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Could I try the piano sometime?" The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't an angry silence, but a surprised one. He could picture the look on her face, the slight frown, the soft, sad eyes. He had seen that look on many faces before. She walked over to him, her footsteps soft on the carpeted floor. She knelt beside his chair. He could smell her perfume, something floral and powdery. "Oh, Leo," she began, her voice full of that gentle pity he knew so well. "That's a very sweet thought. It really is." He knew what was coming. He had heard it before, in different ways from different people. You can't join the soccer team, you might get hurt, you can't climb that tree. It's too dangerous. Let me help you with that. It's too hard for you, but playing the piano, she continued, her tone softening as if to soften the blow. It's very complicated. You have to see the keys, you know? And you have to read the music, all those little black dots and lines on the page. It's all very visual. Her words were like small, soft stones being placed on his chest, one by one. Not heavy enough to crush him, but heavy enough to make it hard to breathe. "It's just not something you could do, sweetheart," she finished. Giving his shoulder a little pat. The words hung in the air. "It's just not something you could do." They weren't said with malice. They were said with the finality of a law of nature, like saying fish can't fly or the sun can't rise in the west, to her. It was a simple, unchangeable fact. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded his head, a small, tight movement. He could feel the disappointment wash over him, a cold, gray wave. He picked up the tambourine and tapped out a simple, hollow rhythm. The silver sound was gone. Now it just sounded thin and empty. The class moved on, but he was no longer really there. He was somewhere else in a big, quiet room, standing in front of a sleeping wooden giant, with a locked door standing between them. The bell rang, a sharp, jarring sound that made him jump. The other kids erupted in a clamor of scraping chairs and chattering voices, a flood of noise that swept him out of the room and into the hallway. He walked slowly, his hand on the wall, the sounds of the school now feeling muted and far away. The bright yellow squeaks and deep brown thuds were all just a dull, uniform gray. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. "It's just not something you could do." As he passed the auditorium, he stopped. He stood for a long time, just listening. He couldn't hear the secret hum of the piano anymore. All he could hear was the sound of a locked door and the key turning in the lock. The words from the music room followed him home like a shadow, clinging to him even in the bright afternoon sun. It's just not something you could do. They weren't mean words. They were worse. They were empty words, words that held no space for argument or hope. They were a statement of fact, as if she had told him that fish can't walk on the ceiling. For the rest of the day, the world of sound he had so carefully built for himself seemed to lose its color. The squeak of sneakers in the hall was just a noise. The rumble of the school bus was just a vibration. The secret hum of the piano was gone, silenced by a voice of gentle pity. That evening, he sat at the dinner table, pushing his food around his plate. His mother asked him how his day was, and he just mumbled, "Fine." He could hear the concern in her voice, a soft, worried hum, but he didn't have the words to explain the hollow feeling in his chest. How could he tell her that a part of him felt like it had been switched off? How could he explain the ache for something he had never even had? For 2 days he stayed away from the auditorium. The thought of passing that door was too painful. It was like visiting a friend who had moved away. The memory was there, but the reality was an empty space. But the music inside him didn't die. It just waited. It was a quiet, stubborn ember, and on the 3rd day it began to glow again. He was walking past the auditorium after the last bell when he heard it, not the piano, but the low, rhythmic squeak of a mop bucket and the shuffling footsteps of the school's janitor. The man was a quiet presence, always in the background, a ghost who cleaned up after the day's noise. He had a kind face, the boy knew, from the few times they had passed in the hall and the man had said a soft, "Hello, son." An idea, small and risky, began to form in the boy's mind. He stopped walking. He stood by the wall, listening to the janitor's steady work. He thought about the locked door of the music room and the key that Mrs. Gable held. But this was a different door. This was the big auditorium door, and maybe, just maybe, it had a different kind of key. he took a deep breath and walked towards the sound. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice a little shaky. The shuffling stopped. He could hear the man's breathing, a little heavy. "Yeah? What is it?" I was wondering if you needed any help," the boy said, the words tumbling out. "I can stay for a bit. I don't have to be home right away." There was a long pause. The boy could feel the man's eyes on him, even though he couldn't see them. He probably looked strange, just standing there in the empty hallway. "Help?" The man finally asked. "What kind of help can you give me?" I can stack chairs," the boy offered quickly. "I'm good at it. I can feel how they go together. Or I can help you pick up trash. I can feel around on the floor." Another long pause. Then the man let out a soft chuckle. It was a warm, gravelly sound. "All right, son. You can help me stack the chairs. But you go home when I tell you to, you hear?" A tiny flicker of hope ignited inside him. "Okay, I will." And so it began. Every afternoon, the boy would tell his mother he was joining the after-school helpers club, a small lie that felt heavy on his tongue, but one he knew was necessary. He would find the janitor, whose name he learned was Mr. Hendricks, and they would work in comfortable silence. The boy was surprisingly good at the work. He could feel the scuff marks on the floor and knew exactly where to push the big broom. He could stack the folding chairs into perfect, neat towers, his hands finding the edges and aligning them with a precision that came from a world of touch. Mr. Hendricks never asked too many questions. He seemed to understand the boy's need for quiet purpose. After a week of helping, the boy felt brave enough to ask, "Mr. Hendricks?" "Yes, son?" "The piano. In the auditorium. Do you ever play it?" The man stopped sweeping. "Nah, not my thing. My wife plays a little, but not me." "Why? You interested in it?" The boy's heart beat a little faster. "I just like how it sounds, even when no one is playing it." "Huh," Mr. Hendricks grunted. "Well, it's an old beast. Probably out of tune." He was quiet for a moment. "Look, I'm done in here. I gotta go lock up the outside. You can stay in here for a few minutes if you want. Just don't touch anything you're not supposed to. And leave the door open when you go. I'll lock it from the outside." The boy's breath caught in his throat. "Okay, thank you." He heard the man's footsteps fade away down the hall, leaving him in the vast, echoing quiet of the auditorium. He walked slowly towards the stage, his steps soft on the carpeted aisle. He climbed the 3 steps onto the stage, his hands finding the cool, heavy curtain. And there it was. He could feel its presence, a large, silent shape in the darkness. He reached out and his fingers touched the smooth, wooden lid. He lifted the lid. It creaked a little, a sound of protest after being closed for so long. Then his fingers found the keys. They were cool, smooth, and inviting. He didn't press down. Not yet. He just let his hands drift over them, feeling the pattern. 2 black keys, then a space, then 3 black keys. 2, then 3. It was a landscape, a map he could learn with his fingers. He found the key right in the middle of the piano. His mother had shown him a picture once and told him its name. Middle C it was his anchor, his home base. He took a deep breath and pressed it down. A single, clear note rang out in the silence, hanging in the air like a perfect, shimmering orb of light. The sound was more beautiful than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling. He felt the vibration travel up his finger, through his hand, and into his arm. It was a voice. And it was speaking to him. He pressed another key, the white one, right next to it. A slightly higher note. He went back and forth, playing the 2 notes, creating a simple question-and-answer melody. Then he tried a black key. A different sound, a sharp, bright sound. He was learning the language. He wasn't reading it from a book. He was having a conversation with the instrument. This became his new routine. Every day he would help Mr. Hendricks, and then he would have his 10 minutes. Then 15, then 20, alone with the piano. Mr. Hendricks never said a word, but the boy knew he understood. Sometimes the man would come back to find the boy still playing, and he would just lean against the doorway in the dark, listening. before quietly clearing his throat to signal that it was time to go. The boy started with the songs he knew. He hunted for the notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, his ear guiding his fingers. It was a slow process, full of mistakes. He'd press a wrong key and a sour note would clash in the air, making him frown. But he would try again, his patience endless. When he finally played the whole melody correctly, a quiet smile spread across his face. He had done it. He had taken a sound from his head and made it real in the world. But playing the melody alone felt a little lonely, like saying a word without any feeling. He started to wonder what would happen if he pressed other keys at the same time. He tried pressing a low key while playing the melody. The sound became deeper, fuller. He tried pressing a few keys close together. Sometimes it sounded beautiful and rich. Other times it sounded like a mess of noise. He was learning about harmony and dissonance not from a teacher, but from the piano itself. He was no longer just playing notes. He was painting with sound. A happy day at school might become a fast, jumpy tune with lots of high, bright notes. A day he felt lonely might become a slow, sad song, using the low, rumbling keys that he could feel vibrating in his chest. He was creating his own music, a secret language that only he and the piano understood. It was a world where his blindness didn't matter. In this world, he wasn't a boy who couldn't see. He was a musician. He was a storyteller. And the old piano in the dark auditorium was his willing, silent partner, telling his secrets back to him in a language of pure, beautiful sound. The world of the school was changing. A new kind of energy buzzed through the hallways, a nervous excitement that was louder than the usual bells and chatter. It all started one morning when the principal's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, filling every classroom and corridor with an announcement. The annual school talent show was coming. For the other kids, it was a moment of pure thrill. Talk of singing, dancing, and magic tricks filled the air. Groups of friends huddled together, planning their routines. For the boy, it was just noise at first. He heard the excitement, but it didn't touch him. His world was still the quiet, dark auditorium and the secret conversations he had with the piano. He continued his routine. Every afternoon he'd help Mr. Hendricks, the quiet janitor, and then earn his precious time alone at the keys. His music was growing. It was no longer just simple melodies he remembered. He was starting to create his own little songs. A happy memory of his mother laughing would become a light, fast tune, his fingers dancing across the high keys. A frustrating day of trying to keep up in class would turn into a slow, moody piece, full of low, rumbling notes that he could feel vibrating in the wooden bench beneath him. The piano was his diary. He could tell it things he could never say to anyone. Mr. Hendricks noticed. The man was a creature of habit and quiet observation. He would often finish his work early and just stand in the back of the dark auditorium, a silent shadow, listening. He didn't know anything about music, but he knew what he was hearing was special. It wasn't the fumbling of a child learning notes. It was something else. It had feeling. It had a story. He saw the flyers for the talent show taped to the walls, and he saw the way the boys seemed to shrink away from the excited chatter. He saw a talent that was meant to be heard, not hidden away in the dark. One afternoon, Mr. Hendricks decided to do something. He waited until the school day was over and the hallways were nearly empty. He saw Mrs. Gable, the music teacher, locking up her classroom. He took a deep breath and walked towards her. He was a man who was more comfortable with a mop in his hand than with words, but this felt important. "Excuse me, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a low rumble. She turned, a little surprised. "Oh, Mr. Hendricks, how can I help you?" "It's about one of the students," he said, shuffling his feet a little. "The boy. The quiet one. The one who can't see." A look of understanding and a little bit of pity crossed her face. "Oh, yes. He's a sweet boy. Very good with the tambourine. Has a wonderful sense of rhythm." Mr. Hendricks shook his head. "It's not about the tambourine. It's about the piano." Mrs. Gable frowned, confused. "The piano? I'm afraid that's not really something he can. I've spoken to him about it. It requires a visual understanding that he, unfortunately, doesn't have." And just listen to me, the janitor insisted, his voice a little firmer now. After school, when everyone is gone, he plays? And I don't mean he just plinks out a few notes. He plays. He plays things that, well, they make you feel something. You should hear it for yourself. Mrs. Gable was skeptical. She imagined the boy randomly banging on the keys, making a noise that a kind old man might mistake for music. But something in Mr. Hendricks's tone made her pause. He was not a man who wasted words. "All right," she said slowly. "I'll listen for a minute tomorrow. But I'm telling you, you're getting your hopes up." The next day she waited. After the final bell, she lingered in her classroom, her mind full of papers to grade. But she couldn't focus. She kept thinking about the janitor's words. Finally, curiosity got the better of her. She walked silently down the hall towards the auditorium. The big doors were slightly ajar. She slipped inside, staying in the shadows at the back. The auditorium was dark and empty, save for the single figure on the stage, lit by a faint sliver of light from a high window. She saw the boy sitting at the old piano, his posture straight and focused. She prepared herself for a cacophony of noise, but what she heard stole the air from her lungs. It started with a few soft, lonely notes like raindrops on a window pane. They were hesitant and full of a quiet sadness. Then the melody began to grow, a little stronger, a little more hopeful. It was a simple tune, but it was played with a depth of emotion she had never heard from a child. It wasn't just correct, it was alive. Then the music changed again. A new layer of sound was added, a series of rich, full chords from his left hand that gave the melody a powerful foundation. The song was no longer just sad or hopeful. It was both. It was the story of a struggle, a feeling of being alone, but with a spark of resilience shining through. The music swelled, becoming more complex and passionate, his fingers moving across the keys with a speed and confidence that seemed impossible. It was not the sound of a boy who couldn't see the keys. It was the sound of a soul who could see the music perfectly. Mrs. Gable stood frozen in the darkness, tears welling in her eyes. She felt a wave of shame wash over her. She remembered her gentle, pitying words. It's just not something you could do. She had been so wrong. She had seen only a disability, a limitation. She had never thought to look for the ability that was blooming in the quiet spaces where no one was watching. The music was not just good. It was breathtaking. It was honest. It was real. She didn't say anything that day. She just turned and walked away, the boy's music echoing in her mind. The next afternoon, she found him after he had finished helping Mr. Hendricks. "Hello," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. He turned his head towards her, a little nervous. "Hello, Mrs. Gable. I heard you playing yesterday," she said. The boy's shoulders tensed. He thought he was in trouble. "I'm sorry," Mr. Hendricks said. "It was okay. I won't do it again." "No, no," she said quickly, stepping closer. "Don't be sorry. It was beautiful. Truly beautiful." She took a breath. "I was wrong, you know. What I said before? I'm so sorry." The boy was silent. He didn't know what to say. "The talent show," she said, her voice filled with a new energy. "I want you to play in it. I want everyone to hear your music." His heart did a little flip. The idea was terrifying. Play in front of everyone? In a crowded, noisy auditorium? I can't," he whispered. "It's just for me." "It started out that way," she said gently. "But a gift like this, it's meant to be shared. Think about it, please. I will be there with you. We can pick a piece together. We can practice. I can help you." Her voice was so different now. It wasn't the voice of pity. It was the voice of a believer. He was scared, more scared than he had ever been. But he also felt a tiny spark of excitement. He thought about the kids in his class who never really saw him. He thought about the feeling of his music filling the empty auditorium. What would it feel like to fill it with people? He took a shaky breath and nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll try." The night of the talent show was a blur of sound and nervous energy. Backstage it was chaos. Kids were running around in costumes, practicing lines, and warming up their voices. The boy just sat on a chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, feeling like he was on a different planet. Mrs. Gable stayed with him, a calm presence in the storm. She didn't say much, just every now and then she would put a hand on his shoulder. "It's going to be wonderful," she'd whisper. Finally, it was his turn. He heard the announcer call his name. There was a moment of confusion in the audience. A few whispers. "Who? The blind kid? What's he going to do?" Mrs. Gable walked him onto the stage. The heat from the stage lights was warm on his skin. The sound of hundreds of people shifting in their seats was like a giant, breathing creature. He could feel the vibrations of their whispers through the floor. He sat down on the piano bench. It felt familiar and solid, the only real thing in a world of overwhelming noise. He felt Mrs. Gable lean down. "Just play," she whispered. "Play for me." "Play for you? Forget they are there." He took a deep breath. He let his fingers find their home on the keys. The whispers in the audience grew louder. What was he doing up there? Then he began to play. The first note was so clear and pure that it cut through all the noise like a knife. A hush fell over the auditorium. It was so sudden, so complete, that it was almost a sound in itself. The boy didn't notice. He was no longer on a stage. He was back in his quiet, safe world, talking to his best friend, the old piano. The music that flowed was the same piece Mrs. Gable had heard, but it was even stronger now. It was the story of his silence, his secret world, and the joy he found when he was finally allowed to speak. The melody was full of longing and discovery, and it held the entire audience captive. No one moved. No one coughed. No one whispered. They just listened, swept away by a story told not with words but with feeling. He wasn't just a boy playing a piano anymore. He was a storyteller, and his story was one that everyone in that moment could understand. The final note hung in the air of the auditorium, a single, shimmering sound that seemed to hold all the feeling he had poured into the piano. It was a note of release, of peace. As the vibration faded into silence, the boy's shoulders slumped. He felt empty, but in a good way, like he had let go of something he had been holding inside for a very long time. His fingers rested on the keys, slick with a thin layer of sweat. He was breathless, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, he was lost in the quiet aftermath of his own creation, a world where only the memory of the music existed. Then the world rushed back in. He became aware of the heat from the stage lights on his face. He could feel the stillness of the hundreds of bodies sitting out in the darkness. He could hear the soft hum of the ventilation system, a sound he had never noticed before. The silence that followed his music was different from the silence he was used to. His own silence was a friend, a quiet space where he could think. This silence was heavy. It was a wall. It was a presence, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. He had done something wrong. He had played for too long, or the music was strange, or they were bored. He could feel Mrs. Gable standing beside him, a solid, warm presence, but she wasn't saying anything. Why wasn't she saying anything? He could feel the judgment of the crowd like a physical weight, pressing down on him. He had been a fool to think he could do this. He had believed Mrs. Gable and Mr. Hendricks, but they were just being kind. The silence stretched on, 1 second, then 2, then 3. It felt like an eternity. He was about to slide off the bench and run, to hide backstage and wish he had never agreed to any of it. And then it happened. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a feeling, a deep, rumbling vibration that started in the floorboards and traveled up through the legs of the piano bench, into his bones. It was a single person clapping, then another, and another. Then, all at once, the wall of silence shattered. It broke apart into a roar. It was a physical force, a wave of sound so loud and so powerful that it washed over him, making him flinch. It wasn't just clapping. It was an explosion of emotion. It was a storm of approval and acceptance that filled the entire room, shaking the very air he breathed. He had never heard anything like it. It was 1,000,000 times louder than the school bell, 1,000,000 times more powerful than the rumble of the school bus. It was a sound that didn't just enter his ears. It filled his entire body. He felt it in his chest, in his hands, in his head. It was the sound of 1,000 people all feeling the same thing at the same time. And they were feeling it for him. For his music, he sat frozen, his hands still on the keys, his head bowed. He didn't know what to do. He had never been on the receiving end of such a thing. He felt a hand on his shoulder, and he jumped. It was Mrs. Gable. He could feel her trembling slightly. He turned his head towards her, and even though he couldn't see her, he knew she was crying. He could hear the soft, ragged sound of her breathing, the little catch in her throat. "Stand up," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're clapping for you." She helped him to his feet. The roar of the crowd seemed to get even louder. He stood there, awkward and overwhelmed, his hands hanging at his sides. He didn't know if he should bow or wave or just stand there. Mrs. Gable put her arm around his shoulders and guided him to the front of the stage, to the very edge. The heat from the lights was intense, but the warmth coming from the audience was even stronger. It was a wall of pure, positive energy. He could feel the individual vibrations of 1,000 pairs of hands coming together in a rhythmic, thunderous beat. In the front row, his mother was on her feet. Her hands were clapping so hard they hurt, but she didn't care. Tears were streaming down her face, blurring her vision of the small, still figure on the stage. She saw Mrs. Gable, the music teacher, standing with him, her own face wet with tears. A wave of emotions crashed over her pride so powerful it almost took her breath away. A stunning awe at the beauty her son had created and a deep, aching guilt. She thought about all the times he had been quiet at home, lost in his own world. She had thought he was just content. She never imagined he was building a universe of sound so complex and so beautiful. She had no idea. She had listened to his simple tunes on their small keyboard at home, but this was something else entirely. This was a soul laid bare. She felt like she was hearing her son for the very first time. The other students in the audience were on their feet, too. The whispers from before, the confused, "What's he doing?" were gone, replaced by a new, respectful silence as they stared at the stage. The boy who was always quiet, always on the edge of things, had just filled the room with more magic than any of the singers or dancers. He hadn't needed flashy lights or a costume. All he had needed was a piano. They looked at him not with pity, but with a new kind of reverence. He wasn't the blind kid anymore. He was the kid who could make the piano sing. Mrs. Gable gently turned him away from the audience and led him towards the side of the stage. As he walked off, the sound of the applause followed him, echoing in his ears. Backstage was a blur of noise and motion. Kids were rushing around, getting ready for the next act, but they all stopped and stared as he passed. Their faces, which he couldn't see but could feel the attention of, were filled with awe, and then his mother was there. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. He could feel her body shaking with her sobs. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, her voice choked. "My wonderful, amazing boy. I had no idea. I just had no idea." He buried his face in her shoulder, the familiar smell of her perfume a comforting anchor in the storm of emotion. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. He just let her hold him. Mr. Hendricks was there, too. The old janitor stood a little ways off, a proud, gentle smile on his face. He didn't say anything. He just gave the boy a slow, deliberate nod. It was a quiet gesture, but it meant more than any applause. It was a sign of respect from the man who had known his secret all along. The ride home was quiet. But it wasn't the empty, lonely quiet he was used to. It was a full, heavy quiet, filled with everything that had happened. His mother didn't turn on the radio. She just drove, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally reaching over to squeeze his knee. He sat in the passenger seat, the roar of the applause still echoing in his mind. He felt different. The world felt different. He was still the same boy, still blind, still living in a world of sound and touch. But something had shifted inside him. The walls he had built around himself, the quiet world he had retreated into, had been opened up. He had let people in, and instead of being hurt, he had been accepted. That night, Lying in his bed, he could still feel the vibration of the piano keys under his fingers. He could still hear the final note fading into the shocked silence, and the explosion of sound that followed. The echo of that performance, and the silence that preceded the applause, would resonate with everyone who was there. But for him, it was more than an echo. It was the first note of a new song, a song that was no longer just for him. The days after the talent show felt like walking in a dream. The familiar world of the school, with its predictable sounds and routines, had been completely altered. The hallway was no longer just a corridor of squeaks and thuds. It was now filled with a new sound, the sound of his name, spoken in whispers that were not of pity, but of respect. When he walked by, the conversations didn't stop. Instead, they softened, and he could feel the weight of eyes on him, but it was a different kind of weight. It wasn't the heavy, uncomfortable stare of curiosity. It was a lighter, warmer gaze of acknowledgement. Kids who had never spoken to him before would now say hello. A quiet, "That was amazing," from a girl in his math class, or a nod of respect from a boy who always sat in the back of the bus. He was no longer an invisible presence, a ghost in the hallway. He was the boy who played the piano. His mother was different, too. The quiet, gentle concern she used to show him had been replaced by a fierce, active pride. The day after the show, she came home with a big box. Inside was a high-quality keyboard, much better than the old, small one they had. It had weighted keys that felt just like a real piano. "You need a proper instrument to practice on," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she helped him set it up in his room. She would often just sit and listen to him play, her presence a warm, supportive blanket. She had stopped seeing his blindness as a limitation and started seeing his music as a superpower. The biggest change was in Mrs. Gable, the music teacher. The next time he walked into her classroom, she greeted him with a new warmth. "Come in. Come in," she said, her voice full of an energy he had never heard before. She pulled up a chair for him right in front of the main piano in the room. "I was wrong," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I was so very wrong, and I want to make it right. This is your piano now, whenever you want it." She started bringing him books, but not just any books. They were books on music theory, printed in Braille. She sat with him, her finger tracing the raised dots, teaching him the language of music that he had already taught himself by ear. It was a difficult new world, full of rules and structures he had never known, but he was a fast learner. He was finally being given the tools to build the worlds he had only been able to imagine before. Even Mr. Hendricks, the quiet janitor, seemed to walk a little taller. The boy would find him in the auditorium sometimes, polishing the old piano with a soft cloth. "Gotta keep her looking good for a star," he'd say with a rare, gentle smile. The man had been his first audience, his first believer. His quiet approval meant more to the boy than all the loud applause in the world. The ripple effect of his performance didn't just stay within the school walls. A parent who had been at the talent show was also a writer for the local online newspaper. She had been so moved by the performance that she wrote a story about it. The headline was simple: "The Boy Who Sees Music with His Heart." The article told his story not as a story about a disability, but as a story about incredible talent and the power of believing in someone. It talked about the teacher who learned a lesson, the janitor who saw a spark, and a boy who found his voice in the dark. His mother read the article to him one evening. Hearing his story told by a stranger was a strange and wonderful experience. The article was shared online over and over again. Soon it wasn't just a local story, it was picked up by bigger news sites. A video of his performance, filmed by a parent in the audience, went viral. Millions of people watched the quiet boy. On the stage, the shocked silence and the thunderous applause that followed. The comments were overwhelmingly positive. People from all over the world were inspired by his music. Among those millions of viewers was one very important person. He was an old man, a retired concert pianist and professor named Dr. Alistair Finch. He had spent his entire life surrounded by prodigies and brilliant musicians. He was often cynical about online viral sensations, which were usually forgotten in a week. But there was something about this boy's performance that caught his attention. It wasn't just the technical skill, which was impressive for someone with no formal training, it was the emotion. The music was raw, honest, and deeply moving. It was music that wasn't learned from a page but felt from the soul. Dr. Finch found the contact information for the school and left a message for the boy's mother. A few days later, the phone rang. The man's voice on the other end was calm but filled with a quiet authority. "My name is Alistair Finch," he said. "I saw your son's story. I must speak with him, and if possible, I must hear him play." The meeting was arranged. Dr. Finch drove to their small town, a world away from the grand concert halls he was used to. He sat in their living room, a tall, distinguished man with kind eyes and hands that looked like they were born to play the piano. The boy was nervous, but the man had a gentle way about him that put him at ease. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He just said, "Would you play for me, son?" The boy sat at his new keyboard and began to play. He played one of his own compositions, a piece that was full of hope and a little bit of sadness. Dr. Finch listened. With his eyes closed, his head tilted, his fingers tapping silently on his own knee. When the boy finished, the old man was silent for a long moment. "You play what you feel," Dr. Finch finally said, his voice soft with wonder. "You don't just play the notes. You tell their story. This is a gift, a very rare gift." He became the boy's mentor. Every week, Dr. Finch would make the long drive to give him lessons. He taught him things Mrs. Gable couldn't. He taught him the subtle art of dynamics, how to make the music whisper and then roar. He taught him complex chord structures and the history of the composers who had come before him. But more than that, he taught him how to trust his own unique voice. "Never lose that," the professor would tell him. "The world has plenty of musicians who can play every note perfectly. It does not have many who can make every note feel like a truth." The community, inspired by the story, also stepped in. A local business owner who had seen the video online was so moved that he decided to do something. One morning, a large truck pulled up in front of the boy's house. The delivery men brought in a huge, polished black grand piano. It was the most beautiful thing the boy had ever felt. He ran his hands over the smooth, curved lid and touched the keys, which were cool and perfect under his fingers. It was a symbol of a new beginning, a promise that his talent would not be limited by his circumstances. The boy was no longer the boy they said couldn't play. He was a musician, a composer, and an inspiration. But in the quiet of the afternoon, when the house was empty and the world outside was just a distant hum, he would sit at his new piano and play. He wasn't playing for an audience or for a viral video or even for his famous teacher. He was playing for himself. He was exploring the new, vast world that had opened up to him, a world of infinite sound and possibility. The story wasn't about the moment he proved them wrong. It was about the symphony that began with that single first touch of the Kiza song that was only just beginning.